clearly into the public domain of accessible journals and books. It's been president of the UK Society of Development Studies, and recently has summed some of this together in an article called Beyond Colonialism, Continuity, Change and the Modern Development Project. And that represents his current thinking of being an activist in the academy and causing and challenging and being disruptive. Let me now turn over to Jeff.
Thank you, Steve. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Because I'm shorter than a lot of other people. Okay, good. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to Shaibal and his team, Niraj as well, for inviting me to this conference. I thought 5 days was going to be a bit of a hard ask, but you're all still here, and I hope by now you're ready for a little bit of sort of entertainment of a slightly different kind. It's a man called John Beams, who was a district collector in Pune at the end of the 19th century, and in the early 20th century he wrote a book called The Memoirs of a Bengal Civilian. Incidentally, when he got to Orissa as the commissioner, he was exceedingly annoyed by the visit of the colonial statistician W.W. Hunter, who proceeded to eat him out of all his precious supplies that had been freighted from Calcutta for his tour. Anyway, these today are a little bit sort of memoirs of a sort of Bengal visitor or something. I also feel a bit like a sort of street busker, in the US or the UK, sort of an awkward presence amongst your busy lives. I've become preoccupied with as John spoke about the other day, I've become preoccupied with the problematic of insecurity and how people engage with it. And for me, that's a kind of powerful ontological driver for trying to understand the relationship between agency and institutional choice. And I suppose I've just been advised that it's clever to get your punchline in at the beginning in case you don't get to it at the end. So I think really what I want to say is that, and I've written a paper about this in a social policy journal, comparative one, that we see in this part of the world a persistence of informal welfare arrangements in highly imperfect well-being regimes, and that's kind of my big context. Now, really, I've got to the point where I'm just trying to make sense of how people behave and the choices that they make and so on. And I suppose that this is a plea for the position of thick description in amongst all the other social sciences that we're part of. I mean, I've witnessed some fantastic stuff here, and there have been figures and quantitative stuff all over it. There's also been some very nice qualitative stuff too, and I guess that's where my identity is a bit stronger. But I have worked with highly numerical people. I've even co-authored a book with somebody called Richard Palmer Jones, who may be known to some of you. It's a sort of mark of distinction, I think. So I think I'll just read a little bit and then move on to PowerPoints. It seems to me that village ethnography is often dismissed for its ability to offer macro level analysis from, as it were, micro insights. So I'm reflecting a bit on the sort of methodology of keyholes through which to gain understanding of the structures which link primary agency people to wider complex institutional landscapes as people try to negotiate adequate functioning security for their own livelihoods and those of their offspring. So I'm assembling just some examples, which I'm going to share with you, of the challenging terrain for social and economic reproduction, and to show how these examples have led me to the construction of a broader conceptual framework, which I hope captures how uncertainty is managed, how risk is avoided, and security is pursued. And I'd like to think that my research experience has been a combination of the art of empathy with the practice of compassionate rationalism. Okay, so I think I've said all that. I got into COSI in 1971. I was at IDS doing something else at Sussex, because in the stately home that IDS ironically inhabited at that time, there was a very large ballroom about the size of this, no, probably a bit smaller, in which some of the economists at IDS, led by Len Joy, had laid out a linear program on the ballroom floor. You had to take your shoes off and pad around in stocking feet to see the intersections between, you know, the ploughing vector and the labor vector and all that kind of stuff. I suppose I saw it because I had done anthropology as a cognate discipline as an undergraduate. I saw this as a kind of uber-rationalist approach to trying to understand these people in this region, which I had never visited. And I suppose the strapline of that was that, you know, I considered, from what I had read, that these societies, the people in Pune and so on, were peasants, to be understood as peasants, not as farmers. And that they had lots of things to optimize beyond, as it were, welfare functions and efficiency and productivity and so on. And this was all in the context of the arrival of green revolution technologies and, of course, the canal irrigation systems that were spinning off from the COSI management. So the core question, in a way, was whether the introduction of these transformations, technological transformations in agriculture, were doing anything to change social structure and power structures and relationships and so on. And maybe if it wasn't changing it that much, how was new wealth being socially converted? Crucially, would I be looking at processes of Sanskritization in which peasant castes getting some kind of uplift from their adoption of new technologies, whether they would then be going through a process of Sanskritization to increase their caste status in relation to others, or would they reject all that and move to inhabiting new status frameworks, more secular, if you like. Well, you know, I was advised by Freddie Bailey, who was my mentor at Sussex, and we talked about how to find a village that might deliver some of this. And in the end, he said, well, you have all the criteria in the world to find a village, yes, but in the end, when you've been to a few, choose one where you feel that you're going to be happy, because you're going to be there for quite a long time, so be happy. I chose one. And then there's this issue of typicality. I often get challenged on that, because it turns out that the village I was in Pune wasn't actually very typical at all. But I don't think you can ever, as a quasi-anthropologist, I don't call myself a real one, but I don't think you can ever really take a village and then represent it as typical. typical. So that's not the methodological point. The methodological point is there enough going on in that space, in that environment? After all, the village is a kind of metaphor anyway. Is there enough going on in that space to give you the keyholes as you follow your actors into understanding wider structures and societies? So that was the idea. Now, like all good anthropologists, oh, actually, I'm not a real one, you have to change the name. So I called this village Deshipur, and it was a bit of a joke because the officials had led me to understand that this village was a high adopter of Green Revolution technologies in both rice and wheat. And I got there and I asked the preliminary questions. Oh yeah, we're doing all this kind of stuff, and yeah, we're growing fertilized wheat and new varieties. Yeah, we're doing transplanted, not just broadcast monsoon rice and all the rest of it. So that's why I went there, and the vibes were nice. But it turned out that they really hated HYV rice. Not nice. So that translates into some ideas about how land was going to be used between those who owned it and those who were tenants, and so on, sharecroppers and so on. So my landowners in the village, they cultivated the deshi rice, but they sharecropped out, ironically, the HYV rice because they had lots of costs attached to it, and had fragility attached to it and unknowns attached to it. Whereas they cultivated wheat themselves with labour, of course, where the risks were less, although it was using new technologies. So that really taught me straight away that you don't have kind of just long-term leasing of land that you never see again, that there was a pattern here of very fluid seasonal leasing as a strategy of risk management, as a strategy for those in power with means of production to offset risk to others who were more vulnerable and so on. Another irony in this location was that, of course, this is the area of the canal irrigation, surface water from spinning off from the coastal embankments. But the delivery of canal irrigation water was hugely problematic in governance terms, very corrupt, inefficient, big technical problems of sedimentation anyway, very unreliable. So those who could opted out. And it was very nice of the Bihar state to set up the Land Mortgage Bank to enable those who could to take loans to buy irrigation equipment, groundwater, and to be able to opt out of the inefficient, corrupt provision that the Bihar state itself was trying to provide through canal irrigation. Just another one of examples of that sort of incommensurate behavior. Well, I suppose the broad conclusion was that there was really no structural change via this technology. I think caste, hierarchy and clientelism were significantly intact, and opportunities from the technology being captured very well by those who were in positions of control before the technology arrived. I hesitated a bit there when I mentioned caste, because, and I told you it wasn't a typical village, because actually the main peasant landholding group in the village was, I suppose you would say, I'm listening to some categories that I've heard over the last 4 days, I suppose you would say it was lower OBC. They were subcaste group of Kunga. Yes, it was caste relations, of course, but in a sense, it was the lower OBCs who were at the top of the pile in the village with everything happening underneath them. Now, even in 1971, there was Rishi-Dev, Mushahar migration, mainly to Punjab, as a function of what was happening in Punjab, as a function of Green Revolution introductions into Punjab earlier on in the 60s. And that had, at that time, significant local effects within the village. In order to raise the money to do two things. One is to secure the rest of your family with some kind of livelihood, and also in order for you to be able to travel and sustain yourself before you entered the highly exploitative labor relations in Punjab, you had to essentially raise a loan as a Rishi-Dev. And that placed your family basically into debt bondage with the landholding families in the village. So deserted wives, bondage into domestic and agricultural labor at sort of under market prices, seasonal. And also, when the remittances started to flow, they were creamed off by some percentage by the richer landowning, one of the richer landowning families in the village, because they had the post office in the village. So the money orders came into the post office, and they were not going to be delivered to these families unless the bakshish was there. So in other words, there were some new opportunities, but to reproduce the inequality that was there in the village. Now, I just want to tell a few tales, but I don't want to be too long because I realize time. Well, the severed arm is a reference to inter-sibling rivalry amongst the Podars, the Banyas in the village. And I had the unwelcome task of taking this man who had his arm seriously chopped to the local hospital. I thought they were all going to pile in with me, but at the last minute they all piled out of my Jeep and said, "You're on your own." I thought, why? No, you just take it. Just leave him outside the hospital. Just leave him outside and don't tell him where you've come from. Well, the whole point of that was to stop the investigations. Well, I didn't do that. I delivered him to the hospital about 8 miles away, and of course he was dying, but I had to confess where I'd come from and all the rest of it. So the big police inspector arrived a couple of days later in the village, and I mean, he had the effrontery to take a bed in my own room in the family that I was living with, and he kind of waited about 10 days until he got his price, much to the annoyance of everybody, because it was all my fault that this money had to be raised to pay the police inspector off. But I learned a lot from that, about inter-sibling rivalry, about their relationships to local bits of authority in the government, and their relationships with the police, and so on. There is a nice end to this story, because when I went back 20 years later, this one-armed man came up and threw his other arm around me and thanked me for saving him. I also sunk my Jeep. You know, when you build a village road, you have bottle pits either side. Well, when it's flooding, you can't really see what's the road and what's the bottle pit. And my very delightful assistant, Vinay, rolled up his trousers and walked in front of me. We were actually going to leave the village for a month. But, you know, we couldn't get the road right, and it was kind of, there was a corner of the Jeep left. So I managed to retrieve my notes and all of that. So I went back to the household, and they said, "Well, we told you not to go until after lunch." And I said, would you bring your tractor out? No, you sunk your Jeep, it's hopeless. You think we're going to take our tractor out and do that as well? No. But we'll help you, don't worry. Just have some lunch, relax. Everybody's been transplanting this morning. You don't want to, you know. then we went, and I had for weeks before this been trying to ask the Ralph Nicholas question about factions and dolls, and I didn't have the right way of doing it, or I was too gutless to do it, or whatever. But I just couldn't get a fix on how these power territories were being operated in the village. But I learned from this, because after lunch, then they took me off my richer peasant hosts, and they took me off into their Mushahartola, and they rounded up with lots of jollity and all the rest of it, and said, come on, Jeff's made a boo-boo up the road, let's come and help him. And we got the Jeep out. And I cleaned it up, and it worked. And I became Mystery Jeff ever since. But the point of the story is that I discovered the Tola, and I discovered those relationships. And a lot of writing is about the oppressiveness of the relationship between the landowner, the tenants, and their workers, and these exploitative relationships, and all that language we use. And you've seen it all across EPW and everything else. It's very interesting. I mean, yes, that's all true in an objective sense, but the terms of the relationship were very friendly, and they were very matey and brotherly, and there was a lot of laughter and fun in that event, mainly perhaps because it was at my expense. Now I just want to talk about the madman with the cuckoo, the harvest man, because I had to walk past him pretty much every day, and he would come at me waving this thing, and I thought he was just going to kind of cleave me neatly down the middle. Said to my host, look, what's going on here? Do I need to be worried? Should I take another route? And all the rest of it. So I just, no, he's harmless. You have absolutely no problem with him. I mean, this guy would come at you with mad, staring eyes and all the rest of it. So, no, he's harmless. Don't worry about it. And true enough, I'm here, right? He didn't cleave me down the middle. But what I learned something about the idea of trust from that. Because I used to think that trust, even as a young man then, I used to think that trust was somebody else looking out for you. You could trust somebody to act in your interest, as it were. But this dimension of trust was about predictability, being able to predict other people's behavior around you, and that's what happens in these kinds of contexts. And the big challenge for people in these sorts of contexts, when they migrate, when they move, when they have to deal with the state and anything else, is that they're starting to deal with strangers. And the point about strangers is you can't predict their behavior. You are in an uncertain world. You don't know the rules of the game and how to do that. So these little incidents informed me about negotiating with power and the problematic of moving beyond the personal to the impersonal, talking about labor territories and factions, talking about trust. And it taught me a little bit about anticipatory cheating. And I'll come back to that, I guess, hopefully. Okay. I also, of course, learned that I just needed to situate this village. I just couldn't learn everything from the village itself, because I'm going to be very heretical here. As Norman Long once said to me, he said, Jeff, you have to remember that sometimes peasants are just stupid. And there are things that they don't know. You think they should know them. You want them to know them. You're trying to get your information from them. But the rest, we're all stupid. There's all things that we don't know. If somebody was to come to my house and ask me about my finances, I wouldn't have a clue. I'd send them to Angela, my wife. And then she'd probably hide it all. So the thing is that you need this kind of broader sense of context. You can't get everything, as it were, from that situation. So I completely accept that. So where I was within the Champanaga Raj, which was within the Benali Raj, which was within the Darbhanga Raj. So clearly we had a pretty good take already on sub-infeudation and the way in which before the Zamindari Abolition Act you had, in the end, 11 layers of rent-seeking from the riot to the state, sub-infeudation. So I went to the Champana garage, and there were 2 or 3 brothers. One hadn't taken Zamindari abolition very well, to be honest. He was the elder brother. Steve and Jerry and Janine might remember, if you're there, that he was a fabulous classical singer. But he also had a red sports car driven by one of his people with a little gun case underneath, and he used to drive around. But the 3rd brother, Bimlal, prince among men, walk up the steps of the old wreck of the house, and inside you've got the snooker room. The balls are all laid out for the next table, covered in dust, trophies round, because their father was a big hunter. And he was the farmer. And he was dealing with the Zamindari abolition and the shift, and the having to come back to only having 300 acres of Kukash land, which they were directly cultivating. Anyway, all of that helped me to write a paper in South Asian Studies called From Riot to Rich Peasant. Okay, I left. Yeah, I told you to tell me 10. Huh? Yeah, okay, fine. All right. I came back 20 years later. Quickly, 1 or 2 things. It was the Gulf War. The Muslim Tola of the village, the Mahalla, called me across and said, Jeff, you'll be safe as long as you stay in the village. But don't go out the village. I cannot guarantee, said Ajis Bucks, I can't guarantee your safety. Of course, everybody was queuing up for scarce fuel. Anybody white was responsible for this, so he would keep me safe in the village. But what it taught me, amongst other things, was that his brother was, I can best describe, as a Muslim cross-dresser. He liked to wear a dhoti, not just a lungi. And he was a police informant as well. But in return for being a police informant, he had preferential access to all the major dealers in the Raniganj block. Fuel was scarce under the Gulf War. It was the irrigation season. It was groundwater. It was diesel. Everybody wanted to cultivate irrigated wheat, other rabi crops in that season was going to need irrigation. He was the only link to be able to get under these very scarce conditions, scarce fuel, into the village. And as he said to me, as he was cuddling his Dalit mistress, because his Muslim wife was a teacher in some other village, the village loved this. Anyway, what he said to me was, who needs land when you've got connections? When you've got all those relationships. Okay, there you go. I had some other problems. Okay, I'm going to skip lots of fun because you haven't got time for it. I could tell you about how I learnt from women in the village by having, because my wife had written to me, having to tell them about the Archers, the village soap in the UK. And the questions that they asked me about a fictitious village in England revealed what their priorities were. I mean, you know, how many saris do the Archer women get in Ambridge? And so on. Lots of other stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. There was a problem, a little minor problem. Relationship's pretty good between the Hindu and the Muslim community. But my Hindu hosts were convinced that those Muslims were overbreeding. Well, you know, okay, I had a bit of data, numerical data. I had a crude laptop doing DBase 4 entry and all the rest of it. So I then took the laptop into the village just before I was leaving. I said, look, you've had this problem. You keep telling me this. here's the data that I've collected from a sample of households and all the rest of it, which tells you that actually you are breeding as much as they are. So, yeah, okay. Yeah, done? You want me to go? 1 minute. I'm going to do this. I'm just going to do this. I'm going to just put that up. Right, we've got the laser thing. Anyway, all of this tells you, all of this leads to this. And here are all your well-being outcomes. Measure them in different ways. Here is what you have to do to negotiate, build alliances, try and negotiate your way with strangers. Here you have an imperfect institutional landscape, state, market, community, for which put caste and all the rest of it. And you have the household, all of them problematic institutional sites through which you have to negotiate. And that is what I conclude as my lens through which to see the relationships between the EMIC and the ETIC. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. As provocative as ever. Okay, I now open it to questions.
Appreciate that the organizer of the conference are trying to get in a lot of these Silver Jubilee lectures this morning. So I'm quite happy to kill it here, and we'll have some fun outside as and when.
We move on to our next Silver Jubilee lecture. The topic for this lecture is Jharkhand in the Belly of the Indian Boom. This lecture will be delivered by Alpa Shah, Associate Professor, London School of Economics and Political Science, and chaired by William Pinch, professor at Wesleyan University, Middletown, Connecticut. Can I please request the chair to take over the proceedings?
Well, it's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Alpa Shah, who will be presenting her lecture. Dr. Shah is associate professor, as we've just heard, at LSE. She trained in geography at Cambridge and then did her PhD at the LSE, and after which she taught briefly at Goldsmiths, the University of London, well, not briefly, 8 years, and then returned to the LSE after that. She's the author of the book In the Shadows of the State, Indigenous Politics, Environmentalism, and Insurgency in Jharkhand. She's published numerous essays and articles and edited 7 volumes, which is amazing. And she's currently working on